Hi, my name is Jonathan Cohen. So I had a question about the low interest rate monetary policy that you mentioned in the early 2000s, and how your view and the with all the different research that was conducted is that it didn't spark the drop in housing that we had. So if, as in your role as Fed chairman, if you were chairman now, do you think that was the
I'm
right?
chairman now.
Yeah. Sorry. If you were chairman in 2001, would you have kept rates that low? And or if not, do you think it was the correct thing to do? Although it didn't, although you don't think it affected the housing crisis.
The very first, I believe, yes, the very first speech, I was a governor of the Fed during that time. I was on the Fed board during that time. And the very first speech I wrote when I became a governor in 2002 was about bubbles and financial supervision and regulation. And the theme of my speech was use the right tool for the job. The problem with tying interest rate policy to perceived bubbles and asset prices is it's like using a sledgehammer to, kill a mosquito. I mean, the problem is housing is only one part of the economy. And interest rates are dedicated to achieving overall economic stability. So we estimate that in order to have stopped the increase in house prices, interest rates would have had to been raised very dramatically in a period where the economy was very weak. Unemployment was still above normal. Inflation was falling down towards zero. And so generally speaking, the right way to use monetary policy is to achieve overall macroeconomic stability. And that doesn't mean you should ignore financial imbalances. And I think what we could have done, the Federal Reserve could have done, would have been to be more aggressive on the supervisory and regulatory side to make sure, for example, that the mortgages that were being made were of better quality and that firms were appropriately monitoring their risks and so on. So I think the first line of defense should be regulation and supervision. Now, I think one of the lessons I talked about today was not to be too sure of anything, to be humble. And for that reason, I think we should never rule out the possibility that if all of our regulatory and other types of interventions don't achieve the stability in the financial system we want, that as a last resort, monetary policy might be modified to some extent to deal with that. But again, because monetary policy is such a blunt tool which affects all asset prices and affects the entire economy, if you can get a focused laser type of tool, that's going to be much better for everybody. Yeah.
At the end of the lecture, you mentioned the role that global imbalances played in fueling the housing bubble. So doesn't the current monetary and fiscal policy that focuses on boosting consumption in the United States from borrowing more, doesn't that kind of lead us down the same road of overconsumption from borrowing that we had that got us into the crisis in the first place? Well,
first of all, we'd like to get a better balance in general. So monetary policy stimulates capital formation as well. It also tends to promote exports. So we would like to get overall, over time, we'd like to get a better balance of consumption, investment, and exports, as well as government spending. Those are the main components of final demand. So monetary policy is consistent with a better balance. But that being said, we're now way below where we were before the crisis. Consumer spending has not recovered. It's still quite weak relative to where it was before the crisis. Private debt has come down quite a bit. And importantly, you mentioned the global imbalances. So we're talking about the current account imbalance or the trade deficit that the U.S. has. It has come down quite significantly. So all those things have moved, if anything, in some sense too far in the short run because we lack a source of demand to keep the economy growing. Now, again, I agree that just as every country needs to have an appropriate balance of consumption, capital formation, exports, and government spending, and that's an important task for us going forward. But right now, in terms of debt and consumption and so on, we're still, way low relative to the pattern before the crisis.
My name is Alexander Akel, and the latter part of your lecture was about monetary policy in the 2000s after the dot-com bubble and how interest rates were kept low, of course. You argue that that wasn't a trigger to the increase in the increase in house prices. But to look at it from another point of view, what's your take on the argument that the low interest rates cause private investors and banks to make riskier trades because of the low interest rates at the time, and how that could have also been a trigger to the crisis?
Well, that's a good question, and I think there is some effect of low interest rates on risk-taking. But once again, very similar to the previous question, it's an issue of getting the right balance. During a recession, generally speaking, on most dimensions, investors become very cautious. That's certainly where they've been for much of the recent past. And so, again, you want to get an appropriate balance between the amount of risk being taken, not too much, not too little. And but once again, this is yet another reason why financial supervision and regulation needs to be playing a role. Particularly with institutions, large institutions, banks, we need to be looking directly at those firms and making sure that they are managing their risks appropriately. So it's a question of what's the right tool for the job.